Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Unseen Beings podcast. My name is Erik Jampa Andersson, and I'm your host and the author of Unseen Beings: How We Forgot the World is More Than Human. In today's episode, I'm thrilled to welcome our very first guest on the podcast, Dr. Jack Hunter. Dr. Hunter is an anthropologist exploring the borderlands of consciousness, religion, ecology, and the paranormal. He lives in the hills of mid-Wales with his family and is a tutor with the Sophia Centre for the Study of Cosmology and Culture at the University of Wales Trinity Saint David. He teaches on the MA in Ecology and Spirituality and the MA in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology courses, and he's also a tutor with the Alef Trust on their MSc in Consciousness, Spirituality, and Transpersonal Psychology. His PhD at the University of Bristol took the form of an ethnographic study of contemporary trance and physical mediumship, and he studied secondary religious education at the University of Chester and completed a Permaculture Design Course at Chester Cathedral in 2017 with Sector 39, and worked on the One School, One Planet project between 2016 and 2019 to develop an interdisciplinary permaculture curriculum for schools. He's also a musician and an ordained Dudeist Priest. We cover a lot of really fascinating stuff in this episode, including animism, spirits, stories, ecology and spirituality, and we even get some of Jack's thoughts on AI and the recent surge in interest surrounding UFOs or UAPs. It's really great to have you here as my first guest on the Unseen Beings podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
It's lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, of course. I have to say, you've written a lot of really incredible things. You've written and edited quite a few books and written a lot of articles. Greening the Paranormal was my introduction to your work, and it had a remarkable impact on the way that I approach the kind of work that I do. It was really formative for sort of developing the ideas in Unseen Beings, but also in my own academic work. It's sort of incredible how closely our fields align and our interests align. Your most recent book, though, Ecology and Spirituality: A Brief Introduction, I have to say, I mean, it's really one of the most brilliant and lucid books on these topics that I've ever read. Anyone that's read and enjoyed Unseen Beings, you should really run and get a copy of this because it's really unmissable. Some of the other works that you've written, so Greening the Paranormal, exploring the ecology of extraordinary experience. There's Deep Weird, the varieties of high strangeness experience. We were just chatting a bit about Folklore, People in Place, international perspectives on tourism and tradition in storied places. Manifesting Spirits, an anthropological study of mediumship and the paranormal. It's just all so juicy. Just the titles alone are absolutely brilliant. So I'm thrilled to have you here. Thanks again for joining me.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm glad it's been useful. The work has been useful for you.
Oh, profoundly. So, I mean, why don't we begin just by, tell us a bit about yourself and how you got into this line of research in the first place. Did this begin with your academic journey, or is this something that started earlier for you?
Yeah, I think actually it is something that's probably started earlier than my academic career. I mean, I was always interested in spirituality. I was always interested in religion. And when I was in secondary school, I was probably one of the only people in my year who actually enjoyed religious education lessons, because I loved learning about different religious traditions and practices and other ways that people live and things like that. Very interesting. I think in some ways it comes from the fact that in my own family background, there was no sort of religious, or maybe there was a sort of a spirituality going on there, but no kind of religious tradition or anything. So it was always something that was interesting to me. And then, as I was growing older, a few interesting little things happened. One thing that has always struck with me was one time my sister, she told us that she'd seen this little man on the shelf in my bedroom. Actually, it was, and it had always sort of intrigued me, this possibility that people might see these kinds of things. And then later on, I had some of my own experiences. Probably the most significant one for me, the one that I talk about the most, was with magic mushrooms, the very first time that I had that experience. And I saw what I said at the time were fairies. I mean, they might not have been fairies, but I saw these beings. They were sort of two-dimensional. They seemed to be two-dimensional, and they were in the grain of wood of a chest of drawers. There was a drawer hanging out on the top, and just sort of moving along in the grain of the wood, there was this procession of little people, and they were kind of like flowing. They looked different to the rest of the sort of psychedelic kind of stuff that was going on, because they were doing something deliberately. You know, they were in a procession, and they were moving along, and there was someone sort of a leader of the procession, which I think was female, and it looked at me, kind of sort of clocked me, and realised that I was paying attention, but then just sort of carried on as if, you know, it didn't even matter. It doesn't matter if I'd seen them or not. They weren't interested. And yeah, that was an interesting experience for me because, well, obviously for obvious phenomenological reasons, when I came to sort of tell people about it, there was, you know, skepticism and almost a kind of negativity towards, you know, seeing fairies. And that's the kind of thing that sort of got me interested in why some kinds of experiences it's okay to talk about. You know, like say I had some sort of spiritual or religious experience with you know, Jesus or something like that, then it might have been accepted as a kind of real experience. But because it was this sort of, okay, I guess in a way kind of a meaningless experience, it was kind of an everyday kind of occurrence. It wasn't sort of spiritual revelation, but it was powerful nonetheless. And because it involved things that I thought of as fairies, you know, it had this extra layer added on top of it. So when I went to university, I started to become interested in, because I was studying anthropology anyway, started to become interested in different ways that people experience and interpret those kinds of things. And that's what led me into spiritualism, because obviously a place to go to find out about that kind of stuff is to people who regularly engage with it, or, you know, claim to engage with it. And that's what I did. So I started to go to spiritualist churches and sit around in the congregations and just listen to people. And I heard people talking about spirits. This was in Bristol. And I heard people talking about spirits in a really sort of everyday kind of sense. It wasn't extraordinary for them necessarily. And they would attribute things like skipping CDs and stuff to, back in the days of CDs, to you know, spirits interfering or cheeky spirits getting involved and stuff like that. And all of this stuff I just found, you know, obviously really interesting. But for whatever reason, I found it was quite difficult to get a rapport going with the group. I think it's because I wasn't very outgoing, really, quite inward. And so I did a bit of research online, tried to find a smaller community or a smaller group that I could sort of get into and establish a relationship with. And I found this group called the Bristol Spirit Lodge. And it just happened to be about 10 minutes, 15 minutes walk down the road from where I was living in my student house, which was handy. So I sort of sent them an email, and I got in touch and talked to them, and the leader of the circle invited me over and we talked about it, and she told me how, you know, she'd never really been she'd been kind of spiritual and that kind of thing, but had never really been active until she got invited to attend a séance where she heard a voice that she recognized, and saw all sorts of other interesting things. And basically she decided that she wanted to do her own sort of experiments with it, to set up her own circle so she could do it all on her own terms and make sure there was no trickery and things like that. So she started to invite just her friends over to come and, you know, sit and develop trance. And eventually other people started to come in. You know, they put a website up and things, and that's how I found them, through their website. And they had all these recordings, probably still up there, of you know, seances and stuff. So it was super interesting, and they were very welcoming to me. And even though I was, an anthropologist or coming from the university, but I made it clear that, I wasn't exactly interested in debunking anything or trying to prove anything, which often is the case when people come into these kind of groups. But actually, I was there to sort of experience it and, find out what people's interpretations are and all that kind of stuff. But then that's a kind of classic kind of bracketing approach, in the social sciences. You don't have to worry about whether these things are real or not. You just get on with the practices and see what people are doing and what they believe and what the culture is. But when I started to engage with it, and this was even in the very first seance that I went to, it instantly became clear that that wasn't quite everything that was going on. So for instance, I saw the medium had gone into a trance, different spirits started to talk through the medium's body, and they might be convincing, they might not be convincing, they're interesting anyway. But for me, the most interesting thing that happened in that first seance was I saw this green face appearing over the medium's face, like it's almost like a glowing, translucent kind of mask, and it looked like a stereotypical kind of Shaolin monk kind of face, like a bald head, Chinese kind of face. And it just appeared over the medium's face like this, and then it just slowly sort of slid down, and it disappeared over the chest. And I felt in myself when I saw it that it was a hallucination. Because I saw these little lights around the medium in the background, and we were in low light conditions in the seance, and it's like, well, these kind of conditions can induce all sorts of interesting visions. So I just kept it to myself. I didn't want to make it seem as though I was someone who was sort of claiming to have extraordinary experiences, or make a big scene about, like, what for all I know is just a common everyday kind of seance, nothing special or anything like that. But when we went back out into the house afterwards to talk about what people had experienced, someone else independently said, "Did anyone else see that green face?"
Wow.
And I had to say that I had seen it, but I did think that it was a hallucination. I thought that I was projecting it in some way, or that the light conditions were creating this thing, because it didn't look like it was out there. This felt subjective. I suppose everything feels subjective in a way. But, then someone else, independently kind of verified it in a way. So in this first seance, it is obviously something more than just my perception of it. There was someone else's perception of it as well, basically. Suggests that perhaps something actually was going on. So when you start to have those kinds of experiences, that bracketing approach starts to fall away, because you want to think about the reality of things. You don't want to just ignore that. And so really my research has been trying to think of ways that we can talk about those kinds of experiences, of paranormal experiences or spiritual or whatever we want to call them, in a way that doesn't try to explain them away, doesn't try to reduce them, and that doesn't ignore them by putting brackets up, but actually, says, well, this is an experience that people have. Let's look at the phenomenology of it and take it from there, rather than dismissing it from the very beginning. Yeah. And really, that's what's led me into exploring all these different sort of avenues for thinking about extraordinary experiences, the paranormal, and that kind of thing.
That's fascinating. I'm curious because, I think for a lot of folks, we think of seances as communing with dead humans. And I'm curious how the folks in that group perceived their own, or sort of negotiated their, subjective experiences and the sort of, phenomenological, phenomena that they were, witnessing, in terms of the, sort of human or non-human orientation of those beings. Because this is, this is really the thing about your work in greening the paranormal particularly, and I think a lot of your other work as well, that I find so deeply satisfying, is this transcendence of an anthropocentric sort of, construct surrounding all paranormal experience. Because growing up, I think for many people, it's sort of implicitly assumed that if something goes bump in the night, and if that is a real something, it's going to be a dead human. That's, ghosts are I think, still the most prominent, maybe, extraterrestrials, ultraterrestrials, or whatever you want to call them. But those are the most prominent forms of paranormal belief, it seems, amongst the average person. And that's always struck me as a fundamentally anthropocentric kind of assumption, that if something exists in a spirited form, it must be a dead human, because who else could possibly, appear in such a way? So how was that perceived in that environment? And how did you come to really sort of challenge those very deep-seated, I think, anthropocentric constructs surrounding paranormal experience?
Well, yeah, it is interesting. In the Bristol Spirit Lodge, for the most part, they understood them as, like you say, as humans, deceased humans. But there was one spirit who came through quite regularly, and I had a chance to talk to them a few times, who didn't refer to himself as a human at all. In fact, said they'd never actually been physically incarnated. They'd never had a physical body. But he called himself Elf. And which makes you wonder whether
Yeah.
and he was different to all of the other sort of spirit characters that came through. Most of the spirits came through. They said they might have been someone who had been alive on the earth and who died, and they would have a bit of a backstory about themselves, about who they were and that kind of thing. But Elf didn't have any of that, and all he seemed to be interested in was just sort of having fun and enjoying himself. And you'd ask him questions, and he would just say, "I am me, I just be, I am free." And that was basically kind of like his mantra. And obviously, it's interesting. It makes you wonder. I don't think that he was a human spirit that was coming through. And they didn't. The group didn't reject him because he wasn't a human spirit or anything. He was welcomed. He was playful. And he was also one of the ones who was sort of trying to produce physical phenomena in the seance room, so trying to move objects and things like that. Whereas others, I think, it was more difficult for them to express in some way. I think that's part of the thing that's going on as well, that these spirits, human spirits that come through in seances, they might not always necessarily be complete personalities or persons, and sometimes you only get a partial kind of expression of that person coming through. Whereas with Elf, it was very strong and distinct, all the time. But still, he was the same. He was just like that. He was carefree, having fun. Whereas the human spirits that come through were, they may have had traumas and things like that, and they remember their deaths and all of that kind of stuff. Elf didn't have any of that, so it makes you wonder about the different things that might be coming through in seances. And then obviously there's all the stuff about tricksters, different kinds of entities come through. Elf was definitely a trickster for sure, quite a friendly trickster, but there could be not so friendly tricksters who are pretending to be deceased humans, or taking aspects of personalities, maybe fragmented personalities. I don't know, it's getting a bit far out, but yeah, there was a variety, and the people didn't they didn't see a problem with that necessarily. And I think if you accept that there are human spirits, then it becomes easier to accept that, well, animals might have spirits, for example. And then you can take it a step further to plants and beyond. And then, angels and stuff like that are quite commonly spoken about in sort of spiritualist circles.
Yeah, and demons.
Yeah, exactly. And earthbound spirits and all sorts of different kinds. So yeah, I think it points towards well, you'd need a grimoire to
Yeah.
encompass all of these different beings. Yeah.
I find it quite fascinating that, we have these sort of expectations. What you were saying earlier, I think that really rings true. It's, if you have an extraordinary experience and if you can contextualize it in an anthropocentric or a binarized sort of good bad sort of framework, then it becomes legalized to a certain extent, and it becomes something that we can actually grapple with psychologically and sort of phenomenologically. It's easy to process the idea of a dead person, a dead human person. It's easy to process the idea of an intrinsically good spirit, or a good god or angel or what have you, or an evil spirit, a demon or something of that type. But it's quite difficult for people in, I think, the modern world, and it's been the case probably, since the Industrial Revolution, with the sort of, movement away from nature spirit paradigms as something serious, other than the reenchantment movements that emerged following that. But it's quite difficult for people to process the possibility that there could be beings that fall outside of all of those parameters, that are not intrinsically good, they aren't intrinsically bad, and they're also not intrinsically human. That other category, I think, is very difficult for folks to wrap their heads around. Do you see that changing in the sort of spiritual circles? I find that aspect of the advent of spiritualism in European and neo-European societies to be really fascinating. Sort of accepting the implicit assumption from the sciences that nature is disenchanted and it's all in this supernatural domain of good and bad and dead humans. But do you think there's a shift now towards a more sort of animistic orientation?
I think there might be a shift occurring. I mean, there's certainly a lot more people talking about these kinds of things, which I think is very positive. But I think the shifts are occurring from interesting directions as well. So the
Yeah.
way, for example, Monica Gagliano and all of
Yeah.
that kind of work that's coming out of sort of more sort of hard sciencey kind of
Yeah.
orientations, but the implications are pointing in the animistic direction. And I think
Yeah.
those kind of things are going to percolate out into the wider culture. I mean, Merlin Sheldrake and all of that kind of
Yeah.
stuff, making it very, very palatable for a wide audience. And I think that we will start to see a shift in the way that people think about it. I mean, it's a shift in the way that I think about it. I'm thinking more broadly about mind in nature or in the world, and as a bigger context to think about all sorts of different kinds of encounters with spirits and things like that, like
Yeah.
an expanded like natural history of consciousness that goes out beyond organisms, into other whatever more subtle layers of reality.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a more organic kind of model, I think. A much more organic, flowing kind of way of thinking about these beings, not as anomalies or
Yeah.
as sort of discrete and cut off from the rest of nature and the rest of the evolution of consciousness, but as sort of embedded within it and a part of it, just like everything else.
Yeah.
I think in that way, it resonates really nicely with indigenous animistic perspectives on the
Yeah.
world as inhabited by many points of view, many perspectives, and we're all embedded within that, relating with each other. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's the direction that I think it's pointing in, from science, from the humanities as well, and also I think from people's experiences. We go out and try to engage more with the world. We start to see the life and the mind that's there.
Yeah.
I think Monica Gagliano is a great example because she's adopting a scientific frame, although she does have this shamanistic
Yeah.
communication plants as well. But this science can provide a framework for engagement with the world, and the more scientists that engage with these things, the more they realize that actually there's a lot more mind going on here than people have given it credit for. So it's really, yeah, I think it's an interesting time that we're in. It'll be interesting to see how it sort of pans out and whether it does percolate into the culture, or whether that some sort of barriers are going to go up at some point. Or say, actually, no, we can't take it any further than this.
Yeah. I mean, that's really, I guess that's the question, because we've seen, for me, like Monica Gagliano's work, Stefano Mancuso, Suzanne Simard, like, the folks that are sort of working in this plant neurobiology kind of sphere. It's an absolute revolution in scientific understandings of biological life and the nature of consciousness and so on. I think to a similar caliber as the sort of Darwinian evolution in a lot of ways. And yet, for me, the Darwinian evolution is a great example of how the things that we know don't necessarily impact the ways that we live and the ways that we feel. The Darwinian evolution didn't actually do very much to impact the ways that we treat animals and other biological organisms, despite being quite certain, that they are in fact our kin, that they're our cousins, we're actually biologically related, which was quite a revolution in thought for a lot of folks at the time, not for everyone. But the impact was disturbingly minimal, until the 20th century, really, with folks like Jane Goodall. And even then, I think if you pull an average person off the street and really, push them on the question of animal sentience, what the things that they might believe to be true or feel to be true are often quite out of step with what we know scientifically to be at least most likely true. So I've been very curious about this. How are the discoveries of plant neurobiology really going to impact the lived experiences of people living in the world in relationship with these beings? Is it going to actually make it into the philosophical and moral realm of really, critically pressing some of these important questions? Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure. It's for me, I find their work absolutely fascinating. It was a big part of what caused me to really shift my focus a bit in Unseen Beings, from originally focusing on spirits to focusing a little bit more on the beings that are unseen as a consequence of our disregard, as opposed to being unseen in a conventional sort of invisible sense. But, I think it really goes to show that, science and facts and figures aren't really enough. We need stories. And that's where I think animism comes in very strongly as an integral component. We have to be approaching things in a more animistic fashion, in a way that really embraces the mythic dimensions and the dimensions of enchantment to really create serious change.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Stories. And the interesting thing about, Darwinian evolution is that the story that was used to pump the idea into the culture was a story of survival of the fittest, and, basically a capitalist interpretation of evolution. It wasn't an animistic interpretation, which could equally have been the case. I mean, obviously there are differences in Alfred Russel Wallace and his interpretation of evolution is similar to Darwin's, but it incorporates a spiritual element. And you wonder whether, if Alfred Russell Wallace's version of evolutionary storytelling had made it into the popular consciousness, rather than, it's not even Darwin's, it's more T.H. Huxley and those kind of guys who took Darwinian ideas and made them into a bigger kind of developmentalist philosophy. But I mean, they fit it into this, framework of, survival of the fittest. So we might be related to all the other animals, but it's a competition, and someone's got to win it. Whereas it could be seen differently. We're related to all the animals, therefore we should establish good relationships with them, rather than trying to kill them, maybe. But so the story is the way that we frame the scientific findings is important, isn't it?
It reminds me of, I'm trying to remember which book it was in. One of the sort of history of astrology books, but like the Copernican revolution was very similar in that respect. The reason that people really embraced it wasn't because of its evidence base. It's based on the fact that it told a compelling story. They were able to augment the sort of, earth-centered approach into a god-centered approach, thinking of the sun as being somewhat akin to, the all-father and everything revolving around him. And mixing these sort of, which were very en vogue at the time, ideas of, mathematics, and also this sort of sophistication of the perfection and the sort of aesthetic beauty of the model. And that's what compelled people to really embrace, a heliocentric model of the solar system, of the solar system, as opposed to just data. So it seems really essential, and I love that Monica Gagliano really embraces that, and I think Stefano Mancuso does as well, and a lot of other folks. Peter Voloben, I think has also really supported bringing in the storied and relational element to these kinds of findings. But it is quite interesting also, and I'd love to know your thoughts on this, is that the beauty of animism, and especially the beauty of what I call eco-daemonology, or like nature spirit paradigms, is its ability to also transcend strictly biological categories and the idea of minds and consciousness being restricted to discrete biological organisms. Plants already kind of, and fungi force us out of that quite a bit to begin with. But spirit paradigms can give us a lot more room to work with. We can talk about holobionts, we can talk about forests and lakes and rivers and mountains, entire ecosystems as potentially beings as well. What are your feelings about that?
Yeah, well, I feel that that's the direction that all of this points in. That it's not a sort of, it's a continuum or a spectrum of mind throughout nature, from organic things out to more subtle kinds of beings and different kinds of intelligences that have evolved just like by our intelligences have, but in completely different kinds of contexts. So you might have sort of like well, there's been a lot of interesting stuff recently about sort of like sentient plasmas and things like that, and how plasmas as like a third state of matter, like another niche that mind can kind of move into and occupy. But plasmas are just one possible configuration of stuff that's in the cosmos, and mind could probably inhabit niches all over the place. It makes me think of like like H.P. Lovecraft and these cosmic beings, that have been existing for aeons. They've evolved out in the depths of space, and they're so vastly different to us that we would never possibly comprehend their way of thinking. But if we're thinking in terms of this like spectrum of mind, they're still on the same spectrum as us. They're still, we've all evolved from somewhere, and that's the way I think that's the direction that things are pointing in, personally.
I want to come back to Lovecraft in a second, and to sort of personal mythologies, because that's something that is really close to my heart, and my research as well. But I think it's important, I'd love to hear your sort of explanation for folks that are maybe familiar with various interpretations of this idea of animism. And I've talked about it a bit on this podcast and also in my book, but I think it's always useful to really clarify precisely what we're talking about when we speak of animism, partially because Tyler's sort of interpretation of it still has some cultural purchase, and people still think of it as this kind of just belief in spirits, and every rock has a spirit, as opposed to the Ojibwa man that tells Hallowell no, but some do, which I think is an important distinction. But yeah, can you provide your sort of definition of animism?
I usually, when I'm talking about animism, I think back to Tyler as my starting point, because he's the guy who sort of introduces the term into our lexicon. But obviously his interpretation of it, like I was saying before, is bound up with this evolutionist kind of thing. And he's basically saying that animism is primitive belief, and that European society and things like that, science has moved beyond it, even moved beyond religion. And so it's the oldest, most primitive kind of way of thinking about the world, which is obviously, problematic. especially as animism persists. It's something that is contemporary. It's not a fossil.
Yeah.
So the way that my shift in thinking about it came when I started to read about the new animism.
Yeah.
People like Graham Harvey and Nuritbird David, and how they basically reframe animism in terms of relational ontologies, so that it's not so much about spirits necessarily. It's more about understanding a world that is constituted from relationships, and relationships not between things that are dead or unsentient or just matter, but relationships between persons essentially. So I think animism is actually, like these guys say, a relational ontology, a model of the world that says relationships are the building blocks rather than atoms, and that the world is personal, so that even different kinds of things that we might think in our Western framework anyway, we might not think of as even capable of being persons, actually could be and probably are. So like you're saying, rocks and even just matter in general could be. So that's my way of thinking about it. It's all about relationships and persons. It's kind of holistic. And I think that in some ways this is what's missing from the sort of plant science kind of angle.
Yeah.
Is that, and also with thinking about sort of intelligence and consciousness in non-humans from a scientific point of view, is that we're always looking for the sort of bits, the pieces of it, and we say, oh look, they can remember, but they're not conscious yet, and they can they can process information, but it's not conscious. We're not seeing it as a person. And if we looked at that, then as not just a collection of different kinds of cognitive processes, but as a person, then we might start to, science might start to move in different directions, and rethink this idea of trying to make sense of the world from the bits instead of from the wholes. So I think animism is, could be a really useful scientific framework. That's where I'm coming from with it anyway.
Yeah. I love what Graham Harvey says, that animists are people who believe that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human. I think that's, it's such a brilliant sort of encapsulation of that worldview, which it's the difference between primitive and primordial is so subtle yet so important. The research seems to indicate that animism predates, certainly, religion as we know it, but it also predates, even ancestor veneration, the existence of high deities and gods, predates potentially beliefs in an afterlife. I've always found it fascinating that Tyler thought of this as sort of the primary delusion. It's the first sort of descent from some kind of rational experience of reality. For me, it's the natural state, and you can see that so clearly in children as well. It's the way that we're naturally sort of brought into the world. It's the way that we naturally perceive it. We have to be deconditioned, or we have to be conditioned out of it. We have to be taught that actually, animals don't have souls, and plants aren't really alive, and there are no fairies and elves and so on. These are things we have to really teach children, because for them, the alternate is far more natural. It's far more innate.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting issue here to do, talk about the ecological self and that kind of thing, and how we think like in terms of like the natural state of being. Might well be, from an animist perspective anyway, would be a state of sort of relationship, of being in a network of relationships, and not necessarily being an individual, but being dispersed throughout a community. And I think this is what when people talk about the ecological self, this is what they're talking about: a state of being or consciousness in which that is experienced as your kind of reality. And I think we are, in a lot of ways, conditioned out of that we're taught to be an individual and to be, to be our own celebrities and that kind of thing, and to accrue wealth for ourselves. That's all part of a bad story that we've been telling ourselves. And there could be alternatives. I think these animistic frameworks do give us alternatives to that, definitely.
It reminds me of, I'm trying to remember which organization this was. There's some non-human rights organization in the States. I think possibly the organization that was trying to free Happy the elephant from the Bronx Zoo. It might not have been them, but it was some organization that works on non-human rights. And they're currently very limited in which non-humans they're concerned about. They're concerned about, I think, whales and elephants and maybe some primates. And I was reading through their materials, and they explain, which animal or which beings are they really concerned about the rights of. And it's by their own definition, those that seem to have some degree of consciousness, of sort of self-consciousness. And their definition of, their sort of parameters of establishing a conscious being included specifically the ability to differentiate oneself from one's environment and to sort of see oneself as separate. Yeah. And I just found that so profoundly ironic that, this is, and very telling that this is how we really think that intelligence manifests. This is how beingness is best exemplified, is through this differentiation of self from other. Not just differentiation, but really a complete removal of oneself and one's own experience from that of our environment, which just seems absolutely insane to use as the basis for something like consciousness, especially since, as you said, plants can see, smell, taste, touch, hear, remember, share information, learn. They can do all of these things that clearly require some sort of experiencer, even if it's not an essential soul in sort of, if we want to get into philosophy or, like Buddhist philosophy, what have you. But certainly experience is being had very clearly. It's self-evident that that's the case. And yet we have such a hard time understanding that is the foundational layer of what it is to exist as a sentient being. But I found that very unfortunate and disturbing that one of these organizations that's really trying to champion looking after the welfare of non-humans is so limited and so ironically limited in the ways that they perceive consciousness.
Yeah, definitely. It's a strange thing. We do limit ourselves the way we think about these issues, and we're always just trying to reduce things down into neat, easy kinds of categories, when actually the world doesn't seem to really work like that. It's much more dynamic and doesn't want to be constrained.
Humanity versus nature, great example of that.
Yeah, exactly.
What about because I had a conversation not so long ago on another podcast about this, and the host was really quite adamant about the fact that animism doesn't matter, that it doesn't actually matter whether we perceive other beings in the world outside of the human, because it has arguably no impact on the ways that we actually behave and live. And I note, I think you mentioned this in Ecology and Spirituality, the research of Stephen Mayer and Cynthia France, talking about the fact that individuals with, quote, a higher sense of emotional connection to nature were more likely to engage in pro-environmental behaviors. And there's some research to support this. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's all sorts of different kinds of strands to it. I mean, Theodore Rorschach, the eco-psychology guy, he said that or he suggested that animism has got this sort of proven ecological utility. That we can look around the world wherever we go, and we'll find examples of animistic societies where people are engaged in respectful, relationships with the land and with various different kinds of non-humans in the contemporary world. So they're not evolutionarily outdated or anything like that. They're as equally adapted to the world today as any other kind of system. And yeah, I mean, it's not always the case. There are examples, obviously, of indigenous traditions that have destroyed ecosystems and things like that, and Easter Island and stuff. But there are many examples where it is a sort of ethical framework that guides and directs people's behavior. And this is part of the reason why there are these pushes to recognize the legal personhood, even if not the personhood of rivers, and different kinds of ecosystems. Because if you treat something as a person, then you have to treat it with respect and dignity and all of the kinds of things that we would normally associate with interacting with another human being. So you have to ask permission and get consent and all of these kinds of things. So on that level, it does matter as well. If we started to interact with the world as if it was personal, then our behavior would change. And it goes the other way. And this is probably the way that in the majority of Western post-industrial societies have been treating it, is as inert matter that is there for us to do with as we please. And that's the opposite end of the spectrum, isn't it? And that also has a proven non-ecological utility. It results in degradation of ecosystems, a reduction of biodiversity and all of that kind of stuff, reduction of variety. That points towards reductionism again. So it's that old thing, isn't it?
And as you say as well, not just biodiversity, but psychodiversity. John Keel's discussion of that, I believe, and you mentioned that in your book as well. That's a dimension of it that I think is very poorly addressed.
Yeah, but the when we talk about biodiversity again, we think about it in a very anthropocentric sense, because we're treating it as a tool for correcting anthropogenic climate change. We need more biodiversity so that we can continue to survive. But if we take all of these lines of reasoning, even coming from the science with Monica Gagliano and that kind of thing, of plants as having this subjective dimension to them, then biomass isn't just biological material, but it's also mind and culture as well, which is the other interesting aspect of this. When you have minds and things, then they interact with each other and they have shared ideas and values and stuff. And I think this element of psychodiversity has been for far too long overlooked. It makes me think of tree planting initiatives and that kind of thing, which are being sort of mandated by governments and stuff, which is it is a good thing, but at the same time there's no real sort of consideration of it. I mean, we're planting new communities of beings and things like that. They're not just objects for our benefit. We are creating a community of trees that might last 1,000 years, and all of that kind of stuff. They will develop a culture and all of that kind of stuff. It's just not considered. And I think that is a real shame.
Yeah. There's I pulled a quote from your book that says precisely that. It's in Ecology and Spirituality. You say, quote, our attitude towards the use of trees considers the value of woodland biomass in terms of its ability to rectify anthropogenic problems, rather than for the intrinsic value of the trees themselves, which I think is really, it's spot on. And I mean, this raises the question, which I think is one of the sort of fundamental questions that we all are sort of forced to try to deal with and to provide some guidance on. We know very well that the sort of existing structures, sort of global capitalism and the energy sector and the animal industrial complex and military industrial complex, all of that are major parts of the major hyper object problems that we're facing. But modern environmentalism, eco-modernism isn't necessarily operating from a different starting point. This is to your point about planting trees, and a lot of the initiatives and just the ways that we frame climate change and the environment environmental crisis is very frequently fundamentally anthropocentric and a question of mismanagement of resources and sustainability of our systems of exploitation, though we don't really want to acknowledge that exploitation is in fact what we're trying to sustain. But how do we actually create the kinds of changes necessary to actually, turn that corner into a more holistic and more genuinely effective method of engaging this sort of, ecological self and working towards a brighter future, saying that with a lot of air quotes, because I think this idea of perpetual progress is itself a bit of a part of the problem. But what are some practical steps that we can actually take on a, not just a personal level, but also on a social level? I think so many folks feel this, this helplessness and this climate anxiety and a sense of, well, what can I do if it's not just going and planting trees and protesting against oil companies and so on? How do we actually move forward with this kind of knowledge and integrate it?
Yeah, I think obviously I don't have any definitive answer, but
Right.
um, I do have some ideas. There's a few different things that could be done that could make a difference, I think. One of them that I write about in the Ecology and Spirituality book is, the value of education and how, our education system is still geared towards, like we're saying, the same things as everything else, towards individual success and all of that kind of thing. But if it wasn't, and if it was geared towards, again, appreciating the value of relationships, if it was engaged with, it helped to engage kids with the actual living world through practical gardening or any, those kinds of things. All of these things have got the capacity to trigger a shift, on an individual level. They're wider social things that can be done, but they can inspire people. And we know how, education system inspires people anyway. But
Yeah.
If the story behind it was different, then it could inspire people in all sorts of different directions. And I think part of my reason for talking about that is because of obviously I'm in education a lot, but the One School One Planet project, we tried to, we weren't trying to produce any kind of spiritual responses, and I don't know if we did because I didn't do any questioning to find out if we did or not. But from talking with other people who have been involved in permaculture, just through engaging with the world, through doing things, through getting hands in soil and stuff, they develop this much more personal relationship. I spoke to people who had worked with willow trees, and he set up a willow business, and he spoke about the willow in this sort of relational way. And so it doesn't start off as a spiritual thing, and it might not even be interpreted as a spiritual thing, but it comes to that because people establish the relationship and they build up that kind of friendship with aspects of the living world. And it could be as much as a kid going out on I like the idea of going on philosophy walks, just around the school campus or things like that. But seeing a butterfly when you're talking about Plato or something, I don't know. It could be anything, that triggers something in someone. So I think, those kinds of changes have got some possibility of having an impact. But at the same time, when I was in school, we were told about climate change and pollution and all this kind of stuff 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And we're still in the same situation, if not worse.
Yeah.
Has anything actually percolated through again?
Yeah. Which comes back to my, stories. What is the role of stories and of mythology, particularly? You talk about, personal mythologies, which again, for me has been really prominent in my life. I mean, for me, I think anyone that knows me and my work knows that, Tolkien has been the biggest influence on, I think, the way that I view the world. It's what brought me to spirituality in the first place and what really sort of set me on my path. and his work still remains sort of the basis of my sort of personal mythology. It's a framework through which I perceive and relate with the world without the sort of trappings of belief and dogma and things like that. What do you, I mean, what do you feel the role is of stories and the potency of stories and mythology particularly, and how can people engage in that more deeply with hopes of being able to produce this kind of change?
Yeah, I think again there's different aspects to it. So on the one hand, there's like the sort of cultural power of stories, like we were talking about before, where stories sort of can guide behavior and give us like an ethical framework to live by, or they can give us a sense of direction or purpose, like we were saying with evolution and survival of the fittest, or the relational model, or whatever it is. But there's another aspect to stories as well, which I think doesn't really get enough kind of credit, and that's that the actual, again, the more sort of extraordinary aspect of stories. And coming back to H.P. Lovecraft again, I wrote a chapter about H.P. Lovecraft and Arthur Machen and those weird fiction guys, and how they, when they're writing their stories, if they've been successful, then we as a reader feel the fear, and it conjures within us a sense of the actual numinous. And I think in a lot of ways, and Tolkien does that amazingly, and lots of people, lots of writing does that. Stories can do that, and I think that's sort of a real sort of almost a magic of stories, is that they can actually induce within us the feelings or the experiences that they describe, and that that can give us empathy for other people. It can give us insight into other people's perspectives, points of view, ways of understanding the world, and then we can pick and choose bits of the stories that resonate with us. And I think that's what we do. We all construct our personal mythologies in that way from multiple sources. But if we have a wider option of mythologies available to us, then all the better. If we're only given one story in the education system, which is the reductionist, materialist, capitalist story, then we don't have much choice, do we?
Nope. No, indeed. Yeah, Ursula Le Guin once said, one of my favorite quotes ever, but particularly from her, she says, what fantasy can do that the realistic novel generally cannot do is include the non-human as essential. And I find, with fantasy, Lovecraft is a brilliant example of this in, that very, terrific sort of side of things. But, it's that capacity to actually include non-human perspectives and characters as intrinsic parts of the story, which is something that seems to be really lacking in contemporary drama and sort of the serious stories that we tell. You look at most of the films that are generally up for Oscars and most of the books that make, bestseller lists and so on, you very infrequently find fantasy there. And even the conceptualization of fantasy and the marginalization of it as this sort of children's form of literature, or this immature form of literature, is, I think, quite telling, because usually the thing that differentiates it from serious storytelling is its inclusion of non-human perspectives in earnest. But that seems to be precisely what we most desperately need, and it's what we've had for at least tens and tens of thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years as a species. It's been the backbone of predominantly animistic societies. And it's quite interesting that now, in a world in which those stories are really seen as quite, inferior, we're also living in a world where we're quite incapable of recognizing the experiences of non-humans.
Yeah, exactly. But very nicely said.
I wanted to we should probably wrap up soon, but with Greening the Paranormal, because that came out a while back, I don't remember when precisely, but you talk a bit, or there's multiple pieces in it where there's discussion of what we now call UAPs, UFOs, extraterrestrials, or elsewhere you speak of these, and others have as well as, ultra terrestrials. But in the past year, even, there's been a massive explosion of interest in this kind of phenomena. For good reason. And there's a lot of, the cases in the States, presentations made to Congress. And, there was this incident in Mexico, which I think is still quite unusual and a bit unresolved. But I think it would be interesting just to hear you talk a little bit about that pivot, because that's something that I find absolutely fascinating. And every time I talk to people about it, it sort of blows their minds a bit. So I'd love to just have you sort of explain that shift in perspective and ways of looking at it, especially the way that it ties into our relationship with the land and nature spirits and so on.
Yeah, well, there is a lot of interest in UFO, well, or UAPs at the moment. I don't quite like the shift to UAPs.
Yeah, no.
In some ways, it's unidentified anomalous phenomena, but it's very broad then, which might be a good thing.
Yeah.
Maybe they're talking about much more than just UFOs. But anyway, it's not a new thing by any stretch of the imagination, and there are accounts of what we might consider these kinds of experiences or sightings of these kinds of things going way back, obviously, into antiquity, and at least it seems that way. And then there's all of the, ufology of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. There's a whole load of interesting stuff that's already out there. And I think, people who are new to this field because of the recent revelations should spend some time acquainting themselves with what people have already written about it, because there's so many different perspectives already out there, different ways that these kinds of things could be interpreted. And you mentioned the ultra-terrestrial idea, which I think is a very interesting concept, which is that comes from, I think John Keel was one of the first to really use it. I'm not sure if he coined the term. I think there's some sort of disagreement about that, but he was definitely popularized it. And his idea was that these things are not from another planet or another world, but they're actually things that come from the Earth, and they might be manifestations of Earth energies. Paul Devereaux's done a lot of writing about how UFOs and things, sightings like that, might be a consequence of Earth faults and things like that, in which case they are of the Earth and not necessarily extraterrestrial. Or there could be ideas about sort of nature spirits and that kind of thing, more sort of esoteric kinds of ways of thinking about it, where the lights and things that people see coming out of caves and mountains and stuff are spirits of the mountain or things like that. And then there's the sort of crypto-terrestrial kind of argument as well, where there might be sort of secret or hidden species on Earth that maybe there are humans who are hyper-advanced, which is not really, well, what I think, but it's possible. Yeah, or other kinds of biological species that have evolved on the Earth, and they are responsible for these things. But yeah, I think I'm sort of quite open about the possibility that they might come from both. Some of them might come from the Earth. Some of them might be tectonic phenomena. Some of them might be evolved here, existed here for many thousands of years, and some might even be from other planets. The thing is, we might even be from other planets.
Yeah.
We don't really know. I think it's much more sort of, the truth of it is much more sort of spread out than any kind of simple way of thinking about it. It's not just aliens from another planet, but it could be. And then there's also the sort of high strangeness element of UFOs, where it's not just seeing strange objects or weird sort of mists and stuff, but where there seems to be a connection to, for example, spirits of the dead. As one example, people have claimed to be abducted aboard these craft, which again takes us into more shamanistic kind of territory as well, and have seen dead loved ones aboard and had interactions with other kinds of beings and spirits. So there's this whole element of it as well that doesn't fit quite nicely into any of these frameworks, really. That it's just a natural phenomenon, or it's or whatever it is, or it's just a technology. if it is, then why is this weirdness associated with it as well? And I think that high strangeness aspect is ignored in the popular discussions about these objects and events these days. But if you look, like I was saying, if you look back at the literature, it's actually central to it. And people like Alan Hynek, he was one of the first. He was an astronomer. He was one of the first serious UFO investigators, and about as sort of mainstream as you can get, being hired by the Air Force and stuff to do Project Blue Book and stuff. And yet he recognized this high strangeness factor. And in fact, he coins the term high strangeness for us. He gives us a nice way of talking about it, but basically saying that there are some kinds of UFO experiences that are very simple, and like you see a light in the sky and it's moving in a strange trajectory. And then there are other kinds that are sort of high strangeness, where all sorts of weird stuff happens. You get poltergeist activity following you home after seeing a bright light in the woods, and you start to have visions of dead loved ones and stuff. Other kinds of psychic and shamanic kinds of experiences. So yeah, I think it's very weird. It's interesting that there is this sort of solid, well, seemingly solid kind of like radar style observation of things, but it doesn't take us, into the stranger elements that also seem to be associated with the phenomenon. So I think that's where we should be thinking, at least partially anyway.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. I think it's a great example of another one of those sort of anthropocentric myths for a very technological age, thinking that they must be humanoid beings from a distant planet who came here to visit humans specifically because we're the most important beings on the planet. So they're here because they're just so obsessed with us that they want to abduct us and impregnate us and dissect us and do all of these things. And it's quite interesting because, as you said, so many of them are, seeing lights flying in the sky, and just a few hundred years ago, and still today in many parts of the world, that would be immediately perceived not as a UFO or an alien, extraterrestrial being, but as something like a nature spirit or a god or an angel or a demon or a daemon or what have you. But it's quite, it's really, it seems to be very much a reflection of where we're at as a species, as in our technological development, and our sort of even the conceptualization that it's beings inside of a ship is quite a reflection of the ways that we perceive the world and our own values and our own technologies, as opposed to any kind of a rational sort of process of inquiry. I've always found that quite interesting, and I love the way that it's approached in your work and in some of the works that you mention as well, because it is so prominent, and it seems to be something that we can't avoid. we really can't ignore that this is something that there's really solid evidence behind, and that a lot of people are trying to really look at it rationally. But we have to accept our own preconceptions going into that supposedly rational process.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. These, like you say about it's quite anthropocentric to think of it in terms of ships or vessels like that. But these objects like tic-tac shaped, like ovals or geometric kinds of forms and things, it's super interesting.
Yeah.
Are they ships, or are they they could be sentient things, or sentient objects, or whatever. It's so the possibilities actually are endless, and I think we limit ourselves, unnecessarily in thinking about these things in those terms. We should be more open to interesting things. It's like, we didn't think that plants had these capacities until we started to engage with them in that way, and it might be the same with these objects,
Yeah.
Until we start to engage with them in a different way, we might not be able to understand, or we might not perceive clearly the consciousness or intelligence of them. Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting few years, seeing how it unravels.
Any thoughts about AI? Just as a last little thing, you make a comment in your book. You actually use it's quoting Stefano Mancuso, who's Stefano Mancuso and Monica Gagliano were also major inspirations for me. But Stefano Mancuso and Alessandra Viola, they say that it's difficult for humans to, quote, understand living systems that think differently from us. Indeed, we only seem able to appreciate intelligences very similar to ours. I've found it quite interesting, these conversations surrounding AI and the tendency to project sentience onto AI. There's a lot of folks, I think, who would find it a lot easier to think that, ChatGPT is sentient than to think that a cockroach or a tree or a daisy is sentient,
Yeah.
which I've always found quite fascinating. But I'm curious what you think about that. And also if you think that technologies like AI and, even virtual reality, augmented reality, etc., can benefit us in any way, helping us, sort of recover a sense of what it means to be human in a more than human world.
Yeah, I think part of the reason why we might find it easier to imagine AI as intelligent is because obviously we've created it as an interface that we understand, which is
Yeah.
the easiest thing to do for us. It would be probably much more difficult for us to create a non-human interface for
Yeah.
AI to express itself in different ways that we wouldn't recognize, because we can't conceive of how to do it. But I can conceive that it might be possible to have it designed so that it communicates in a non-human manner. I don't know whether AI actually is sentient or not, but I don't really have a problem with it being sentient. I think most things probably are, to some extent
Mm.
at least. And if we put together a sort of a system that is able to communicate and express, then I don't really see any reason why that might not become sentient. Or just provide, it depends again what we think about the nature of consciousness, whether it's something that emerges from complex physical structures like brains or computers, or whether it's something that is sort of external and is filtered in. Because if it's filtered in, like, the filter idea, then, it could be filtered into a computer, or it could be filtered into anything if it had the right kind of interface.
Mm.
But if it's, if consciousness is dependent on a physical structure, then it's possible that AI could become conscious if it was complex enough. It might be possible. It could be that it's not complex enough yet to be conscious, but it will become conscious.
Mm.
But it's not being designed as a conscious thing. It's designed as a pattern recognition tool. So it's not, it's giving the illusion, I think, at the moment, of intelligence catered to us in a way that we can understand. There might be an intelligence behind it that's not able to express itself through human constructs,
Mm.
But yeah, I think it's interesting. I also think that mind in nature has a tendency to move into new niches, and digital sphere is a new niche that's opened up in the world. And if there isn't minds in there now, then I think probably there will be at some point. They'll move in as a new space opens up, and evolve in new directions and adapt to a new environment. So yeah, I don't have a problem with it being conscious or becoming conscious, and it probably is in some way anyway. It just can't tell us that.
I love that. Well, I cannot thank you enough for joining us here on the Unseen Beings podcast. I really it means a lot. I'm fascinated with your work, and yeah, I really appreciate you being here. Is there any last things you want to say? You might want to. It would actually be great if you could just mention really quickly the Sophia Centre. People might not be aware that that exists.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah, the Sophia Centre is where I work with the University of Wales, Trinity Saint David, and it was one of the first, if not the first, academic centres to focus on contemporary cosmologies, and especially astrology. So broadly, the research interest is in human relationships with the sky. But the Sophia Centre has also expanded out now from just looking at the sky into broader ecological perspective as well. So the MA in Ecology and Spirituality, which I teach on, is all about, how human beings interpret and live in the world. So while previously it was about how do we interpret and understand the sky, now it's expanded out to the whole of nature. So I suppose one thing that people might be interested in is checking out those MAs that the Sophia Centre runs. There's the MA in Astrology and Cultural Astronomy, which I also teach on. The modules cross over both, and the MA in Ecology and Spirituality. I also teach for like you mentioned, the Alef Trust, which is a sort of transpersonal psychology teaching organization, and we teach a module there on approaches to consciousness, and we look at how we might understand consciousness from a variety of different perspectives, from all the way from sort of neuroscience right the way through to Vedic and spiritual kinds of approaches as well. Yeah, and I have hopefully we'll have a couple of courses coming up to teach before too long. I'll be doing another run through of my Spirits, Gods and Magic course through the Sophia Centre, which is an introduction to the anthropology of the supernatural. And I'm also hoping to do a course later on in the year on religious experience and the paranormal as well, which I just started to think about. So yeah, a few things of interest there.
Sounds incredible. Any new books in the pipeline?
Well, yes. I'm doing a book at the moment called Of Minds and Monsters. Well, that's the title that I've got for it. And it's this stuff that we've been talking about, sort of fleshing out I think the way that I'm thinking about it is where sort of Fortean high strangeness and consciousness studies and the philosophy of mind come together, and thinking about how there might, how these different frameworks like panpsychism and things like that, if we take the implications forward, then it opens up all sorts of interesting possibilities for encounters with truly unusual forms of consciousness that we might not really be able to understand from our human point of view, but that might be out there in the world, in these niches, waiting to be experienced. So yeah, I'm working on that. I've also another book. There's an edited collection that I've done with Bernadette Brady in the Sophia Centre. We teach a module on sacred geography, and we've just edited a book of student essays from our sacred geography module, and they're all looking at different kinds of places. There's stuff about like a motorway underpass as a sacred space, all the way through to encounters with tree spirits and that kind of thing. So that should be coming out before too long, before the summer, I should think.
I can't wait to read all of it. Your work I just think it's the most interesting work out there. So I really hope that folks go out and get some of your books, and maybe even apply for your courses, because it's incredible what you're doing. And again, I really, really appreciate you being here. So thank you so much.
Thanks for asking me.
Thanks again to Dr. Jack Hunter for joining us in this fascinating discussion. This is our first video episode, but there are many more to come. This podcast is produced by Shri Mala and is made possible through the support of our wonderful patrons, including Heidi Wong, Robin Greenfield, Eugen, and many others. If you want to learn more about unseen beings and support our channel, please visit www.unseen-beings.com. And until next time, this has been Erik Jampa Andersson with the Unseen Beings podcast. Take care.